And you'll find these under the folder for new files added by instructor in the content page. If you go ahead and take a look at these prep questions, it's just a small few slides that I put together that have a few questions that are involved with the quiz. Now again, there's 30 questions at the quiz, but what it does is it splits it into 15. So what happens is you have 15 questions your first run, and if you do it a second time, you'll get 15 different questions, I believe. So it should be 2 different types of question sets. If you notice that it's not like that, you can let me know, but that's usually what it is. Now, a main recurring theme here for this quiz is the idea of raster and vector and what are the differences. Please remember for this quiz that the words raster and bitmap essentially mean the same thing. If you're being asked a question and they're talking about bitmaps inside the question, that's essentially them talking about rasters. So rasters and bitmaps are the same, and what they mean is pixelated images. Vectors are your geometrical images that don't lose quality when you increase them. Here's a small example question from the quiz. Another technical definition for bitmap images is raster images. And you can essentially just say true, or whatever the answer is for that, because that is essentially what they are. These two words are interchangeable. Now, this quiz does require us to go a bit deeper than just the surface level true or false. You have a question here that a path is a vector object. Now, if you recall from our work with Photopea, when we make a path, let's just see here. If I have my pen tool, I set it onto the path selection here, and I go ahead and I draw something, maybe a little hexagon thing right here. I have my work path right here, but how do I know if this is a raster or vector image? Well, one way you can figure out is what type of image do you make if you try to fill this with a layer. So remember from our work with the wine glass, if we go to, with our adjustments, if you always remember, you have 2 options here. You have a raster mask and a vector mask. And if you see here, I'm not really able to do much with my path. But if you recall from our work in Project 1 with the citrus fruit, the vector mask allows you to go onto the current path. So you can essentially mess around with paths and make it into a vector mask, which means that there's no pixel information inside of this right now. So if I zoom in here really far, it does become the grid, but those aren't the pixels that we're working with. And so essentially what you could say here is that the paths are vector objects, because even here, when we're working with paths, we have to use the vector mask to get to the path. And this is a very specific scenario, but in general, paths are geometrical objects that can be large or small, how we want to make them. And they're not going to lose their quality as we continue to use them. So you can assume that the paths are vector objects. Now, how do we notice again? Well, we notice that there's no pixel information inside of a path. Usually, it's usually just a vector mask. And if we know we have no pixel information, we know that it's not a raster image. And usually in Photopea, we have 2 types, raster or vector. So if it's not a raster, it's going to have to be the vector. Here's a small important question to remember. These are definitely 2 questions on the quiz. If you take the second one, I think. But in general, remember that the differences between vector and raster is that a vector object has the advantage that you can scale it up without losing quality, and a raster image has the disadvantage that if you scale it up, it loses quality. So that's the main differences between those 2. There's some questions here about the pen tool. These are kind of specific, but again, the pen tool is accessed by pressing the P key to get it to your keyboard. And again, there's a very kind of trick question here about open and closed paths, but there is a question on the quiz that's asking about the 2 main paths in Photopea. And those 2 main paths are the open and closed paths. So you're not going to have different types of paths besides those ones there. So that's an example question of what might be on the quiz here, is that these paths, they have questions like, is it a shifting path or is it a closing path? The only two paths that we're working with inside of Photopea now is the open and close path. So don't let that don't let that question trick you up. Now you might have seen from earlier in my example with the pen tool, you saw me going to stuff called the raster mask and the vector mask. There's not too many questions about this, but essentially the difference between these two masks is how they're edited and represented. These two paragraphs here are some interesting information about them, but they're not necessary. What I do want to hit home for everyone here is that you can always edit a vector mask, but raster masks are destructive and not always able to be edited. So you can edit raster masks in some scenarios, but for the sake of this quiz, you can always edit a vector mask, but raster masks are destructive. And what does that mean? Well, if you remember from my dog and, let's see here. Let me make a new project really quick and see if I can mess around with new shapes very quickly. If I go ahead and make one shape here. What's it easy? And on the first shape, I'm going to go ahead and try to apply an adjustment to it. Maybe I'm going to make it, let's see here. Is that going to let me edit? But just remember, I wonder if I could pull up the bird, and that might take a while. But if you remember from our bird and house example a while ago, I was able to make the birds hidden with their smart filters, and the black and white house, I had to delete it because I couldn't hide the black and white filter. So please remember that for our sake here, that the vector mask is able to be edited at all times, but the raster mask isn't destructive. It is destructive, and you're not always able to edit it. Now, we talked a bit about the liquify tool again, but with the liquify tool, there's a question here. In manual liquify mode, you can use the pucker tool, shrink tool, and Photopea tool to move pixels towards the center of your brush. So you might be wondering, okay, well, how do I go about fixing that up? Well, if you go into your code and try to pull up, let me pull up the bird really quick for us to work with. If I go ahead and try to pull up this bird inside of my Photopea, and then I use the liquify tool on this bird, I'm going to go ahead and zoom in, and I would say that you should do this for all the questions that have liquify tools in them. It's just helpful to be able to practice those tools. And so what this question is asking is, does the shrink tool in Photopea move pixels towards the center of your brush? Well, I'm going to hover over the shrink tool. It's right here. Now, my center of my brush is by the beak. So if I'm going to be dragging stuff to the center, my beak should be a bit morphed towards the center. And if you notice, my beak is getting dragged up and down up to the center of where my brush is. So yeah, this one is true because it does move it to the center there. And all of the questions about liquify take this type of question format. It's going to ask you if it moves pixels towards a certain area. Go ahead and use the liquify tool and see if it's doing that, what it's saying it does. Now, again, there's a few questions here that are interesting to look at, but they're a bit more tricky. But you can always ask me questions about these as well as you continue through. The questions about the keyboards, I'm not too concerned about. Of course, you could try using the tool, or using these shortcuts inside of your own Photopea to see what happens when you're using them. Let's see here. Sorry, everyone. Excuse me. Sorry about that. And of course, as you use these tools, you can go ahead and open up Photopea to check if these shortcuts do what they're supposed to. There's one shortcut here that this is a question that if you have it, I kind of wanted to give it to you because it's not working on my end. Inside of Photopea, you'll notice that there's hidden portions in your tool. So what that means is that if you look at your rectangle tool, you have these hidden tools here. There's supposed to be a shortcut that you can cycle through hidden tools in a group using the shortcut key. Or excuse me, using a certain key plus a single letter combination. The answer is shift, but when I use it on my end, let's just say that actually let me see here. Yep, so when I press shift and U, to select my rectangle, it actually doesn't select it there. So I'm pressing Shift and U right now and it's not working. If I press U, it does select the rectangle. And then if I press U again by itself, it cycles through these tools. So for this question here, it's Shift, but if that doesn't work, don't worry about it. That one's just kind of a freebie there. I just want to make sure that no one is stuck on a question that doesn't have a correct answer. But yeah, so these slides here for quiz 1, these are ones that I found were a bit confusing. They're inside of the prep quiz questions, and not only does it provide some insight to what the questions are, but I hope it provides some insight in how to think about these questions and approach the quiz as well.